Welcome to Politically Basic. I'm your host, Kyle Campbell. As we always do, we're breaking down the basics of all political issues so that you get to decide. On the show with me today, the smartest man in the world, literally. It's Frank Gaffney. He's an American defense policy analyst, founder of the Center for Security Policy. Under President Ronald Reagan, he acted as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy. He served as chairman of the high-level group, NATO's Senior Political Military Committee, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Forces and Arms Control Policy under Assistant Secretary Richard Pearl. He was also a professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Mr. Gaffney is the lead author of War Footing, 10 Steps America Must Take to Prevail in the War for the Free World, and co-author of Sharia, The Threat to America, and See No Sharia, Countering Violent Extremism, and the Disarming of America's First Lines of Defense. He hosts Secure Freedom Radio, an hour-long nationally syndicated program that airs every weeknight. His daily Secure Freedom Minute commentaries are heard on over 400 stations coast to coast. He's also a featured contributor to Breitbart Radio and a columnist for Breitbart.com. Frank, you are truly the smartest person I know. I was actually thinking about it just before this interview. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're very kind. It suggests that you don't operate in the largest of circles, if that's the case. But I'm very flattered. Thank you.
Take it. We're rolling with it.
Yeah.
You're a very intimidating human, too. Well, I'm grateful for you and your wealth of knowledge, and happy that you're intimidating in good ways. So thank you so much for coming on Politically Basic with me today.
It's really a privilege, and I thank you for taking the time to drill down on some of these topics, because obviously it's the purpose of your show is to make sure that people have an understanding of things that are going to affect their lives, perhaps very profoundly. And I hope by being more aware, they can affect them positively as opposed to quite possibly very negatively.
Well, I know you're going to help answer a lot of these burning questions that we have. You're just a great human being. I appreciate you so much. You've dedicated your professional life to protecting this country and the people who live in it. Tell my listeners a little bit about the founding of Center for Security Policy and why you started that organization.
Well, it began actually to be a gleam in my eye while I was still in the Pentagon working for President Reagan. And the last year, as I was acting as an assistant secretary, I looked around and realized that a lot of the people that I had worked with in the previous 3 years or so had gone on to other things. They were in academia, they were in think tanks, they were in business, they were in the media, some of them. And the kind of help that I used to get by collaborating with them on the various fights that we had inside the administration, and they were epic in some cases, and the effort to shape policy with respect to, selling ideas to the public were just virtually impossible unless you could kind of call everybody up, retail. And it just wasn't possible given the responsibilities of the office that I was in. So I thought to myself when I left the Pentagon in the beginning of 1988, there must be a place somewhere out there where with a single phone call, you could get the kind of help that I knew was needed. And I set about looking for it. And after about 6 months or so, I just realized that there didn't seem to be, at least on our side of the football, as my friend Steve Bennett likes to say. So I started the Center for Security Policy in order to facilitate that kind of help to people inside government from people outside the government, knowledgeable experts, what I call really the special forces in the war of ideas, and to just sort of give a one-stop shop, if you will, to facilitate that kind of support with a single phone call. And that's what we did for the 37 years that I was working at the center. And it's what I'm doing now at a new institute. We call it the Institute for the American Future.
Well, I like the sound of that. You were in the Department of Defense. also for a very, very long time, and very instrumental there. Tell my listeners a little bit about what the DoD is and what it does. Let's stick to basics here, Frank.
Sure. Well, it actually wasn't all that long a time. It was about 4.5 years, but it was a very formative experience for me. The Defense Department, of course, is, as the name suggests, the place where the United States military is headquartered. Both the 2 million or so uh, military men and women under arms, as well as the civilian leadership, which is responsible for, governing their activities and actions. And that so-called civilian control is a very important feature of our government, by the way. And I had the privilege of serving, as I say, for about 4.5 years under President Reagan in the two capacities that you've mentioned as part of that civilian leadership. And it was really the high point of my career. It's been pretty much downhill from there, but I learned so much on the job under, President Reagan, of course, and his philosophy of peace through strength. And under Caspar Weinberger, who was the secretary while I was there, and others that were part of his team. And it was um, clear to me that it is incalculably important that the public understand what all those folks are doing and how well they're doing it in order for the military of our country to enjoy the kind of support that it requires, especially in a circumstance in which we find ourselves these days, which is to say that there is an all volunteer force. And generally, what happens is a certain group of people tend to volunteer to serve, and the rest of us don't. The people who volunteer to serve typically come from families that have served in the previous generations. Um, they know a lot about the military, but the people who haven't served or don't have relatives who've served or friends or neighbors or what have you may not understand adequately just how important these missions are that the men and women who wear the uniform do every day, and the kinds of sacrifice that's entailed in doing it, not just on their part, and in some cases, unfortunately, of course, that entails the sacrifice of their lives, or maybe limbs, or other capabilities that you know they didn't have to put on the line for us, but they did. And it's important to understand that their family sacrificed tremendously as well. So I had kind of a ringside seat at a very, very historic moment and saw the military, saw the civilians serving in the Pentagon and elsewhere in the government, for that matter, coming together to support President Reagan in one of, as I say, I think an epic struggle with what was then, as he put it, the greatest existential threat to freedom that the world had seen to that point. And that was the Soviet Union, of course. And he was resolved to take it down. He had a mandate from the American people to do it. And I was privileged to have a very small role in helping him accomplish it.
Remarkable. We're experiencing what feels like a number of existential threats right now to the United States. And I think where most people are at with their understanding of international conflicts and threats is what we are seeing happen with Russia right now. And just kind of general, maybe basic understanding of what Putin's intentions are. And then we have all of these other conflicts going on. Can I ask you? Now, there are several, but I think the biggest threat that people maybe don't understand the most is China. And I know this is your wheelhouse, sir, and you understand everything about it. If I were to maybe man on the street interview, just ask someone, hey, what do you think about China as a potential threat to the United States? I think what I get back is, well, I'm worried about it, but I don't know why. So, can you help us understand if they are really truly a threat to the United States and how?
Sure. I've don't claim to understand every aspect of this, but I've been studying it closely. And one of the things, one of those special forces in the War of Ideas teams that we put together about 5 years ago, I guess now, almost six, is something we call the Committee on the Present Danger, China. And one of the things that that committee has been doing um, pretty relentlessly for about 2 years now, which I would really commend to your audience if they're interested in this subject, learning more, figuring out for themselves where the truth lies. We do every week a webinar, usually about an hour, hour and 15 minutes or so, to sort of drill down on various aspects of what the Chinese Communist Party is up to and the dangers that it represents to us and, well, to all freedom-loving people, really. We took the first, I don't know, 70 or so of those webinars and tried to make them accessible to people besides just looking at the videos, which they can do for free at a website called presentdangerchina.org. But we put it in this book called The Indictment, prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and friends for crimes against America, China, and the world. And what it basically tries to do is to answer the question you've just asked, Kyle, to essentially make it as accessible as humanly possible. And I would reduce it down to pretty much this kind of elevator pitch. The Chinese Communist Party, not to be confused with the Chinese people, because I think the Chinese people have actually been as badly abused by these guys as anybody. But what they've been doing to the people of China, they want to do to the rest of us. And that is to dominate, to control, to oppress, and if they deem it necessary, to kill us. In fact, it is part and parcel of the Chinese Communist Party's agenda from its founding to dominate the world and to get rid of the impediment to their doing so, which is the United States. So, what we've seen them doing for decades now is something the Chinese communists call unrestricted warfare, which is to say, an effort to win against a much more powerful nation by sort of stealthily using every instrument short of the old fashioned shooting kind of war to take it down. And that's economic warfare, that's information operations, it's psychological warfare, it's cyber warfare, it's um, sabotage, subversion, intelligence, pretty much you name it. The Chinese communists have used these techniques to weaken us and to try to prevail, if possible, without fighting.
Hmm.
If not, using military means, which they have been steadily building up. In fact, there was just a report right before Christmas that the Pentagon published on Chinese military power. We used to do it as Soviet military power in my day. Chinese military power. And one of the stunning conclusions of this particular report was the conclusion that not since Adolf Hitler's time have we seen a military buildup comparable to what the Nazis did. And we know how that turned out, which was very, very bad for the world, needless to say. And similarly, I think if my old boss, Ronald Reagan, were alive today, he would say correctly, the existential threat to freedom posed by the Chinese communists makes that he reckoned with in his day from the old Soviet communists pale by comparison. So what we're trying to do with our Committee on the Present Danger China, what we're anxious to do with every platform we can, utilize, including this one, is to talk very candidly with the American people about the fact that they've not been properly apprised of what these guys are up to, let alone what their intentions are. And I would say that, Kyle, if I may, if you did that man in the street interview 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, um, you probably would have gotten that kind of abstract answer that, yeah, I'm worried about him, but I'm not entirely sure why. I think today, in the aftermath of one of the particularly lethal kinds of warfare, not an explosive, shooting thing, but deadly just the same, was the biological warfare attack that the Chinese Communist Party launched against us in COVID-19.
Mhm.
And that's what it was. And today, because it's touched almost everybody's life in one way or the other, in some cases, they lost their lives, about 1.2 million of us at this point, and countless others around the world. Maybe you didn't lose your life, maybe a loved one didn't, but you've got continuing symptoms of long COVID, or you just have some kind of cardiac problem, or other uh, things related maybe not to the disease but to the vaccine that you were told you had to take for it. Today, I think most Americans will tell you that they believe the Chinese are actually enemies of this country. The public opinion polling shows that, by the way. And I think they know that in part it has to do with the fact that they did terrible things in that biological warfare phase.
People are afraid to understand that that was a biological weapon. Here in this country, we had mainstream media, particularly, and a Biden administration that pretty succinctly would shut you down or cancel you should you try to associate COVID-19 with Wuhan or something nefarious coming out of China. And we all remember that press conference, the White House presser, where you had somebody saying to President Donald Trump right before he left office during his first term, "Isn't that racist to call it the China virus?" And he said, "No, it's from China." And then, of course, he said
Where
it
it came from.
China. And we,
China.
I love the way he says that. But I think that this country has been abused for the last 4 years in being very fearful of commenting in the way that you just very clearly and factually laid this out. And I do hope that people are coming to this understanding of what a threat China is, because they have been for so long. As long as
Yes.
America's strong, they will be trying to weaken us and take us down in an effort to put themselves forward. So I'm so glad for the work that you're doing, and I think people need to read the book and understand this more, and know too that it is not racist to discuss the efforts of China and their leadership as well. Let me ask you about Taiwan. Now, we hear every now and again it pops up, China wants to take control of Taiwan. They're so teeny tiny, but they're over here a little bit closer to us. Can you explain why Taiwan would be a powerful asset and area for China to take hold of? And what has stopped them being such a big and powerful nation from taking it before?
Those are very good questions. I think that there are multiple reasons why the Chinese have Taiwan in their crosshairs, if I could use that expression. Um, for one, uh, it's a very, very aggravating thorn in the side of the Chinese Communist Party, because Taiwan has emerged as a full-fledged democracy. It is a success story by any measure in terms of its economy, its embrace of capitalism. And these are things that the Chinese communists do not want the people of China to see could be their, lives, their prosperity, their freedoms, um, because the people, some of whom came from China originally, many are not from there, but there is a model that is an alternative to the CCP, as it's called, and that is a threat and must be eliminated for that reason, I think. In addition, as you know, Kyle, there is now on Taiwan a concentration of many of the most sophisticated silicon chip manufacturing foundries in the world. And the Chinese lust after controlling those, because if they control those, this will be the ultimate supply chain. And they're interested in dominating all of them, but this one will really give them control over the economies of every advanced nation on the planet, especially ours. So that's a strategic objective as well. In addition, um, Taiwan changes the strategic lay of the land, if you will. It's actually more the seascape um, profoundly if it's in Chinese hands as opposed to in the hands of our friends. It's a cornerstone of what's called the First Island Chain, which is a series of islands off the coast of China, which effectively serve as barriers to the movement of Chinese naval forces and shipping more generally to the rest of the world. As long as Taiwan is potentially a forcible impediment to the Chinese exfiltration, if you will, out into the Pacific, that will also be a reason why they want to eliminate it. So all of those are factors, but I think at the end of the day, it comes down to this: uh, if they take down Taiwan, they know that will be the end of American influence in the Western Pacific, because every other nation in that area, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, and others, will understand that China is the dominant power, and they had best figure out a way to come to terms with it, obviously on China's terms.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another and very compelling reason, I think, for people who have in mind world domination, as do the Chinese Communist Party.
You say compelling. I would say really, really, really scary. That's so scary. What is Taiwan's military force look like, and who's militarily occupying those waters around that island chain and protecting them essentially from Chinese invasion?
The Taiwanese military, rather, is small. It is operating mostly somewhat antiquated equipment. They have begun manufacturing some of their own. They've been trying for quite some time to buy more advanced gear from us, and the Biden administration has done some of that, but mostly it's dragged it out as much as possible. Um, when you ask who is occupying the surrounding waters and operating in the airspace, uh, it's actually mostly the Chinese military these days. We have freedom of navigation transits that the odd American vessel or one of our allies will make through the Taiwan Strait, or sometimes in the littoral waters in the South China Sea and so on. But the dominant presence, and they have been exercising it in a way that essentially gives them the option pretty much at any time to just roll into a blockade or a quarantine, as some call it, of the island, or perhaps even an actual invasion, pretty much without notice. And that constitutes a very real threat to the relatively small military of Taiwan, and a very real challenge to our military should it be ordered to come to Taiwan's rescue.
Yeah, that's a really it's curious because if Taiwan is small, their military is small, China wants them so much, they're so valuable. It would be game changing for China to go in and overtake them, and they are occupying the space around. What is holding them back from just going in and taking it?
That's an excellent question. And I guess I'd answer it this way. Uh, I believe that if you look around the world today, virtually all of the bad things that are going on are either directly or at least indirectly being enabled by Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Emperor, I call him, and his party. Again, if not directly, indirectly. And even if that's not so, it certainly is the case that either directly or, at the very minimum, indirectly, Chinese communists are benefiting from all those bad things. But I think there's more of an active role being played. I call it strategic arson. And when you look at what Xi Jinping has precipitated in Ukraine, for example, through his um, so-called no limits partner, Vladimir Putin. Uh, I believe this was cooked up when Putin visited Beijing in February of 2023 and basically got the green light, a thumbs up from Xi to invade Ukraine, provided he didn't start until after the Beijing Olympics were over, which is what he did, Putin. Similarly, Iranian leaders and Palestinian ones visited Beijing a few months before they invaded Israel on October 7th of last year, um, of 2023, rather.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's those countries or whether it's countries in which I think the Chinese are actively, trying to strike, uh, sparks into tinderboxes, like South Korea at the moment, or the Philippines, or Guyana in our hemisphere, or Mexico, for that matter, um, in North Africa, the Red Sea, and so on. I mean, you're witnessing sort of well, some call it World War III.
Mm-hmm.
I call it World War Xi
Mm.
because I believe Xi is a prime mover behind all of this. So, in answer to your question, I think what Xi is waiting for is basically the moment when all of those distractions, all of those things that are tying us down, at least with respect to our focus and our energy, and in some cases our resources and our military equipment, by the way, all of that is just having the maximum effect on our readiness, on our ability to do anything should he decide to go into Taiwan or even just blockade it. Um, that I think is the pacing item. And so, just to finish this thought,
Mm-hmm.
the question is that time right now? And is Xi persuaded on the basis of both his sense of the strategic environment he's created with his arson, that is as good a time as any, and that a man who, one of my colleagues who spent his professional career recruiting and running assets for the Central Intelligence Agency for our country, an intelligence officer by the name of Sam Faddis, he's called Joe Biden, quote, a controlled asset of the
Mhm.
Chinese Communist Party, unquote. So an ideal time would be before he leaves office.
Mhm.
And also, and this is particularly unsettling, I have to say, it's a time when Xi Jinping has insinuated into this country over the borders that Joe Biden has left open. By some estimates, Kyle, tens of thousands of soldiers from the People's Liberation Army. And if they're here and could be doing things like, oh, I don't know, but just for instance, burning down Los Angeles or cratering our electric grid or causing massive disruptions in our ports or our transportation system or Wall Street or our economy or assassinating leaders. Well, all of this could come together in a way that I think would cause him to say, okay, game on. We're going into Taiwan.
Okay, I take back my former comment because this is the really, 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 really scary part. Thank you for explaining that. I understand it, and if I understand it, I feel confident that other people will get what's happening. It makes perfect sense that China is essentially triangulating these other countries, pitting them against each other to, they're weakened, they're beholden to China. I'm saying this back to you to make sure I've got this right. Distract the
Absolutely.
United States. We are sending billions all the time
Mm-hmm.
overseas. We're sending our equipment. We sent fire trucks to Ukraine. I didn't know that until
From
recently.
Los Angeles.
And that's where the resources were depleted and these fires have broken out. So he's waiting for this opportune time, Ping is, to weaken everyone, especially the United States. But to your point, Frank, isn't right now, like, in these next couple of weeks, his only window to make a move? Otherwise, we've got Trump being inaugurated and coming back in. And everyone seems to collectively understand that Trump is going to make us safer, stronger, more prosperous, and stand up to these nations and stand up to China. So are we kind of in some like very tiny little terrifying window of time in the danger zone?
I do think this is a particularly dangerous period of time. Like you, and I think like the 55% or whatever it was of the American electorate who voted for Donald Trump, I'm very hopeful that once he gets in, things will start, you know, being reflective of both his leadership as well as his commitment to, as I said earlier, Reagan uh, strategy of peace through strength. Because that's the object. We want peace. We don't want war. And if you can deter it by being so strong that nobody wants to fool with you, that's the ideal.
Hmm.
I will just say that if they, for whatever reason, choose not to or simply can't act during this window, I think the next best time for them would be in the early period of the Trump presidency when he's trying to get his footing and he's getting his people in place and there's still a lot of churning going on. um, so I think whether it's the next few days literally or whether it's the next few months, this is a potentially very perilous time, and it's
Hmm.
it's one of the reasons I'm very big, as is our sort of Institute for the American Future and the various coalitions that we're sponsoring on trying to offer solutions, not just admire the problem. And just to give you one, I mentioned this really, I think, not just unsettling, terrifying fact that there could be multiple divisions worth of probably Chinese special operators in this country right now. We don't know where they are. We don't know what they're doing. Some have been observed, at shooting ranges, honing their skills. Some are said to be growing marijuana in places like California and Maine. But the vast majority of those tens and potentially tens of thousands of these guys, um, these are people who are described typically as unaccompanied,
Mm-hmm.
military aged Chinese men who basically look like, act like, and are in the company of others who look like and act like military personnel, coming usually across the border in small units, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But if those folks are um, here to do us harm, uh, think back again, just common sense. Think back to what 19 such individuals, not Chinese in that case, but young and unaccompanied individuals did to us on 9/11. And those were amateurs, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
not professionals. So thousands is an extraordinary problem. But just I want to come to the point about the solution. I'm arguing that this is a moment when we need to speak frankly to the American people about this as a problem, and that we need to ask their help in what I call crowdsourcing
Mm-hmm.
the kind of situational awareness that we have to have if, God forbid, Xi Jinping does want to have these guys go on rampages across this country that could quite possibly make what's going on in Los Angeles at the moment look like a day at the beach. And I just want to give you this one perfect example of what I'm talking about. As you know, Kyle, what was it, 6 weeks or so ago, the top guy at a huge healthcare conglomerate, United Healthcare,
Mm-hmm.
was murdered on the streets of New York. And the fellow who looks a lot like he was probably the perpetrator was apprehended not on the basis of, surveillance cameras in New York City or the FBI's, data analysis or local law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
It was a guy flipping burgers in a McDonald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania, who happened to see him and recognize him on the basis of, the old points bulletin that had been put out on him. Well, that's the kind of crowdsourcing that I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking about. And if the American people, we don't want them to go into vigilante mode or anything, but we want them to be eyes on, to be informed about what they're supposed to look for, and then to let local
Yeah.
authorities know if they do see something. I say, not just say something, do something. Get in touch with those folks and help them bring these folks into custody such that they can be removed from our country right quick.
I think that's going to be the challenge, right? Because identifying someone suspicious preemptively is so hard, especially when we have been distracted with identifying and being suspicious about a different kind of immigrant, right? We're not looking at Asian looking men who are by themselves. I think culturally in this country, we don't look at someone of Chinese descent, a man alone, unless he's doing something suspicious and think like, oh, that's someone I need to be worried about. So I think the messaging of this and helping people understand what specifically they would be looking for is going to be really critical here, because we're not trained for this right now. We're trained to be afraid of being called racist. Should we
Yes.
point anything out? We've also been trained to be disappointed in our legal system and system of justice when illegal immigrants are arrested or caught doing something criminal and then just released with zero bail, 4 hours later. So I think we've got a lot of work to do on that end of it in identifying what these potential threats are, and like you're saying, help people refocus on what something suspicious would actually look like here. But it's a huge need. I'm afraid we're going to be really caught unaware when the time
Well,
comes.
but look, that's not an accident, comrade, as the Soviets used to say. We have been, uh, conditioned to believe that if we see something that involves a person of certain ethnicity or race or gender or what have you, that we mustn't respond to that in a rational way. I'm not talking about being racist. I'm not talking about, being xenophobic. I'm just talking about if you are told that there are Chinese soldiers in our country and a general profile that they typically would meet, and you happen to come across, especially, a group of them, that's something that you need to be willing to bring to the attention of authorities. And you still may be called a racist or a
Yeah.
hater or a bigot or something, but at the very least, you give people who have the responsibility of protecting our country information that may be very, very important to them doing that.
Mm-hmm. And on that thread, a lot of people have been speaking up and questioning the drones flying over New Jersey and on the upper, northeast, and getting very little information, getting the brush off. This is just ripe for conspiracy theory. What do you think the drones are doing? I've been dying to ask you since I booked you on the show. What are the drones? Where are they from? What are they doing? Are we worried about them?
Well, I think everybody who has had any exposure to this topic, whether they've personally seen them or whether they're just reading about it or they're talking around the proverbial water cooler, are worried about it. Yeah, it's very unsettling. And the fact that it's been going on now for months, in fact, just about a year ago, um, these things were flying for 17 consecutive nights over some of the most sensitive real estate in the country, in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia on the coast there. We've got ports with our major warship and combatants lined up like Pearl Harbor. We've got airfields where our state-of-the-art fighter aircraft are lined up like Henderson Field in Pearl Harbor. Uh, and we're having these things overflying them again, night after night after night after night after night after night after night. And at any point, if they had a thermite grenade on them, they could have taken out a good part of our military capability in one of the other of those places and others besides. So I think we have to be very concerned about it, even if we can't say for certain that those are Chinese drones. They have an enormous drone capability. They have, divisions worth of people here to operate these things. And they have signaled by the kinds of places that these flights are taking place. The New York Post had an article recently in which they talked about 17 different military bases across the country that have had these things flying over them. And they also noted, by the way, that in proximity were properties that were owned by, wait for it, Chinese nationals. So, can you conclusively arrive at the understanding that this is all Chinese? I don't think so. Is it possible that some of these drones are U.S. and are part of a government, operation trying to figure out what's going on in some place? Perhaps some say with a, and I have a hard time, Kyle, concluding that this is a better explanation for what's going on,
Hmm.
but some have said that, we're looking for dirty radioactive
Yeah.
bombs, or maybe even nuclear weapons with these things. Well, that's not exactly good news. But whatever it is, this suggests that our enemies have the capability to operate with impunity in areas of the country where we definitely don't want them to be doing so. And the fact that we're not being told the truth, or really even being given much of an explanation at all, let alone that these things are being allowed to fly where they will, and there doesn't seem to be any effort to capture any of them to, decisively conclude what in fact is going on here. It's all profoundly unsettling. So I think it's something we do have to press for answers, and I'm hopeful that when the Trump team comes
Mhm.
in, they will be providing truthful explanations.
Yes, I believe Trump has said that he is going to release information about the drones. It is concerning because it only further damages the very wobbly trust that the American people have with their own military. And again,
Yes.
goes back to the point of, where do Joe Biden's loyalties lie? I mean, if these are
Mm.
US military drones, and so many questions are being put forward, why don't they just say, hey, they're ours? We can't tell
Mm.
you what they're doing, but don't worry, they're not Chinese or they're not Iranian. Some people had offered that as a potential. So that's an issue on that side of it. If they're
Yeah.
not ours and they are flying over very sensitive military equipment and spaces night after night after night, why in the world is that allowed to happen? So I think on either side of it, there's a lot of concern, and I'm with you. I really hope that we get some answers
Yeah.
soon, because that's not a fun feeling to have something hovering over you night after night and day after day and not know if you're
Yeah.
going to be attacked or not.
I literally, within an hour before this call, I got a phone call from a friend who just had a neighbor photographing a drone hovering over her house. Now, again, this is
Mhm.
sufficiently uh, evident around the country that I think we have to have answers to the question as to what is going on here and why aren't we being told the truth, let alone protected against them. And one of the things, to your point about trust in our government, it wasn't so long ago that this so-called weather balloon
Yeah.
was flying figure eights over some of that sensitive real estate all across the country. And first, the Biden administration lied about its existence, then lied about what it was, and then lied about what it was doing, and then chose not to shoot it down until it had completed its mission. And only then in the water, and I have a sneaking suspicion they hoped they wouldn't be able to recover it. Apparently they did, but it's it's one of these things that just has engendered such mistrust of this operation. And it's compounded, to be honest, by the fact that when they tell us that Joe Biden has not been, well, compos mentis, I think is the
Mhm.
technical term, since he ran for the
Yeah.
presidency in 2016, excuse me, 2020.
Hmm.
It again, it does not inspire confidence, especially when we don't know who's actually been running the country
Well,
all
that's
these
it.
years.
That's the question. And two, and I don't say this to be offensive in any way, but don't you think that since election day, November 5th, all the way up until January 20th, they're just over at the White House and the Pentagon just shredding and burning and just, I mean, they're not just going to leave this answers to all of these questions just laying out for Trump's administration to come in and thumb through and like, oh, that's what that was, and this is the deal. I mean, you've got to logically know that there are some things that are kind of trying to be buried right now. Is that a fair assessment of what's going down in this transition time?
We can only speculate about that. It would not surprise me in the least. But what we do know, what we can actually see, is what they are doing at every turn to try to sabotage
Mhm.
this incoming administration. Let me give you one example that I think may happen in the next week. I'm told it's in the works, and that is getting uh, at least one, maybe two resolutions adopted by the UN Security Council, both of which would have the same purpose, namely screwing Israel and creating conditions internationally that would complicate, if not make extremely difficult, Donald Trump's course correction on behalf of Israel. One would declare that in the judgment of the U.S. government, the failure of Israel to allow sufficient humanitarian assistance to get into Gaza constitutes a war crime, and then set in motion a series of sanctions on Israel for doing that. The second one, and it might or might not uh, manifest itself, I don't know, but I'm told they've also got one that would compel Israel to withdraw its forces from the small sort of buffer zone it's established near the Golan Heights in Syria. And if it failed to do that, as with the other one, there would be, international sanctions imposed on Israel in various ways. These are things, and this is just one of many examples. We can talk about energy, initiatives,
Mhm.
taking oil and gas, deposits offline, precluding them from being exploited. The various initiatives on funding the Green New Deal and putting still more money and getting more so-called refugees across the open border, giving them, paths to citizenship and all manner
Sure.
of other things. These are the sorts of things that are, I think, really utterly at odds with the promise Biden made to Donald Trump personally in the White House to his administration effecting uh, an orderly and peaceful transfer of power.
Mhm.
Um, and the kicker is particularly, Kyle, this is just so aggravating. We've had to listen interminably, both during the campaign and since, to this insistence that the Biden-Harris team are the only thing that stands between us and the end of democracy. Well, democracy is fundamentally about, the popular will. And the
Mhm.
popular will couldn't have been made more clear than in that election. It was a repudiation of the policies that these guys are trying to foist upon us right up until the last possible moment. And I think it's scandalous. And I hopefully will be, wherever possible, reversed by Trump.
Mhm.
But some of these things, like these UN security resolutions, may be very difficult, as I say, to
Mm.
undo. So they should not be allowed to go forward.
It does seem like Biden has gone rogue and is just trying to dump as much quicksand in front of Donald Trump as he possibly can. I think they did it during his first term with slow walking and making so difficult the cabinet position confirmations. And here it's the same game, but just different tactics and strategies. It's really disturbing to see and infuriating because
Yes.
Biden just was at President Carter's funeral. And of course, he had to make it political, right? Saying, well, Carter understood that we don't ever abuse power. And you're talking about the abuse of power and Hillary Clinton sitting behind the row that Trump's in. She's smirking and everybody knows they're talking about Donald Trump. And it's just so incredible that they think that they're getting away with this rhetoric and narrative. And I think that there's been a great awakening amongst the American people reflected in the vote, the way this vote went. It was so dominating for
Yes.
Donald Trump that we're not buying this load anymore.
Mm.
And it's tough to see these things happen day after day in Biden's final days. So thank you
Well,
for
the
breaking that
only thing
down.
I would quibble about is
Mm,
you say Biden's going rogue. I don't even know if Biden is in the mix,
mm.
honestly. But
It's
whoever
such a
is running
question.
our
Yeah.
country, and this is such a talk about scandals. This is such a scandal that we don't know
Hmm.
who's running the country. I don't think there's ever been a time I mean, they point to Mrs. Wilson when her husband Woodrow Wilson, was incapacitated, kind of having a regency for the end of his term. But that's nothing like this, where an absolutely massive fraud, setting
Mhm.
aside the vote fraud, massive fraud has been perpetrated on the American people from the campaign to this day.
Yeah. You've seen the meme that Donald Trump posted where it's the line of presidential portraits, and you have GW and Obama and then Trump, and then you have a group of people and then Trump again, because we know he's not doing it. That is so concerning. I wonder if we will get a little bit more clarity and insight on that, on who was making the calls, who was penning this. Some other kind of leaked behind the scenes information has come out that Joe Biden will just call phone numbers that he knows to try to locate certain people in his administration. And the person will say, well, no, he's not here. He's out doing this. And that Joe Biden will call back 5 minutes later and ask the same question again. So we're questioning the mental capacity and wondering if it's dementia. And the reports coming out certainly sound like he's not, behind the Resolute desk crafting these, complex orders and affecting, international relations in this way with the way that
Yeah,
his mindset is right now. It's really concerning. Well, Frank, I
yeah.
know I've got you for a few more minutes, and I want to get to the question of nuclear weapons.
Mm.
Again, just it gets thrown out there every now and again. I don't think that we collectively have a great understanding of what the true potential for nuclear war is, or if that has changed now, again, that Donald Trump is coming back into the White House. Who's got them? Is it realistic that we would see this in our lifetimes based on what we've just come through and survived? What are your thoughts on that?
Uh, well, I spent much of my uh, career in the Senate and then in the Pentagon, focused on these issues and on deterring what was then the Soviet Union. So this is very much something I'm concerned about. Um, I'm concerned particularly for two reasons. I mean, set aside for the moment the geo um, strategic considerations that are in play, some of which we've been talking about here. I'm concerned that the Chinese and the Russians, the North Koreans, the Pakistanis, the Iranians have all been beavering away at building up nuclear capabilities. Um, One of my colleagues, who's a really serious professional in this space, says that I think the China, if I'm not mistaken, the Russians have put into place in the past decade or so something on the order of 25, 26, something like that, different new nuclear weapons platforms with, you know, presumably new nuclear warheads aboard them. And the Chinese aren't too far behind. They've put into place, just in the past year, I think, 350 new missile silos in the desert, each of which we think will have a very large missile in them with 10 different independently targetable reentry vehicles, nuclear weapons aboard. So right there, you've got twice as many nuclear weapons just in those one, set of silos that we have
Mhm.
deployed in our entire arsenal at the moment. And those are new and presumably, you know, uh, more modern, more effective than what we have basically not done anything to upgrade in terms of the nuclear weapons, at least, since about the time I was in the Pentagon.
Why isn't
We
that a
haven't done a
focus?
nuclear test since
Yeah.
1992, for
Why
example.
not? I mean,
Well, I think because consecutive presidencies, Donald Trump in his first term, I think, tried to get something started in this area, but was not able to do much before it was over. But we've told ourselves that nuclear weapons is so yesterday. that we don't want to spend the money on them. We don't want to maintain the kind of infrastructure that is required to have them and to keep them safe and keep them effective, to make, in other words, deterrence work.
Hmm.
We just we're telling ourselves, I guess, that we could do it on the cheap. And what we've seen now, especially with the Chinese and the Russians joining forces, to say nothing of their allies, the North Koreans and the Pakistanis, and I think at any moment the Iranians, are bringing to bear capabilities that are vastly overmatching ours, even if they were uh, more modern, more tested, more reliable, more effective. I'm not sure that deterrence can be relied upon. And having a Donald Trump in that Oval Office, I think, is a deterrent consideration, to be sure. It's just that, especially if Xi is determined to act before he gets there, or early enough on in his administration that it's very difficult for him to play the kind of role that he would later in his term, in terms of just by the sheer force of his personality, deterring aggression. This is, again, a very fraught moment. Could it go nuclear, as they say? I fear it could. Certainly, Vladimir Putin has been making it plain at every opportunity that he considers these weapons to be just another kind of weaponry, and that he feels that what's going on in Ukraine with our arming the Ukrainians and then giving them permission to attack Russia with more and more capable weapons, to be grounds for using nuclear weapons in retaliation.
Wow, it's like everyone's standing in a circle pointing a gun at each other, and America has a bayonet.
Mm.
I really hope that we catch up a little bit,
Interesting
or
analogy. We have to
it's
start again.
concerning.
This is one of those things. Again, going back to what we said earlier, you've got to get the American people
Yeah.
up to speed
Hmm.
on these issues, and
Yeah.
I, the first to tell you, I know they're not going to want to hear about it, let alone have to pay good money to do something about it. But
Mm.
they're acting on the basis, and it's reasonable, that they've hired adults to do responsible things about all of these questions. And unfortunately, the more they know, the more I think they're going to realize that that's misplaced confidence.
Absolutely. And I want people to have this understanding. It's fascinating while it is mildly depressing as well, but we've got to know. And it is so interesting, Frank. I could talk to you all day and all day tomorrow. But point our
I'm at your
audience in
disposal.
the well, you're definitely coming back on the show, because I feel like even at this time point, we have sort of just scratched the surface here.
Hmm.
How can people find you, read about what you are writing on, listen to you on Secure Freedom Radio? Give us the whole lineup of where we can continue to get informed by you, please.
Well, thank you for that invitation. Um, I can be followed at Twitter at Frank Gaffney. We have a Substack for it's actually a television program now, Securing America. It's securingamerica.substack.com. Um, we have a new website with our new institute, and it's a building, but it gives you a flavor of what we're trying to do with our special forces in the War of Ideas. It also gives you an opportunity to donate if you would be so inclined. It's a tax deductible contribution at usfuture.org.
Amazing. Well, you are such a gentleman, and I appreciate the way that you helped walk us through this conversation today. I can't thank you enough, Frank, for joining me today. And I hope that I'm seeing you very, very soon again, too, in person and back on the show again soon.
I do as well. And thank you for your very thoughtful questions and the opportunity to just do some dot connecting with you. It's been very, very gratifying to me, and I hope helpful to your audience.
Thank you
God bless you.
so much. God bless you, sir. And
Thank you.
thank you all for joining us on this episode of Politically Basic. We're committed to breaking down the basics so that you get to decide. Be sure to check us out at politicallybasic.com and follow us at Politically Basic so you don't miss an episode. We'll see you next time.